Hey everyone, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This show is available on Apple, Google, Spotify, Edify, Liftable, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please take a moment to review it on your favorite platform to let more people know about these interviews with major thought leaders from many fields of influence who show how our worldview changes everything. My guest today is a licensed professional counselor with a PhD in marriage and family therapy. He's worked with individuals and families for nearly a decade, and he's also served in pastoral ministry, which has helped him integrate spirituality into clinical treatment in meaningful ways. Here as we're looking at all of the challenges of Mental Health Awareness Month, please welcome Trent Langhofer to the show. Trent Langhofer, welcome back to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
So excited to be here, Dr. Jeff. Anytime I get the chance to hang with you, it's a good day.
Now, our staff and our students at Summit Ministries know you as Dr. T.
That's correct.
And that is, your doctorate is in counseling psychology.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you've been a really great resource, especially for our summer staff, when they have students who are wrestling through really difficult situations, helping to give them good guidance along the way. So thank you for everything you've done for Summit.
Honored to get the opportunity. You have a great team. I don't know that I'm giving them a lot of new stuff, maybe reminding them that what they already know is good and right and true is effective and useful. But yeah, just a great crew here every summer. Honored to get to play a small role, man.
Yeah. Well, it means a lot. And I want to have you as my bodyguard as well as my therapist.
You name the time and place, I'm there,
right.
man. No problem.
Some of the issues we tackle these days, we've been
right.
asking,
that might not hurt.
Yeah, we might need some help.
That's right.
But you know, we're talking about Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's an important time to remind ourselves that we want to be physically healthy as people, but we want to be mentally healthy as well. And we see a lot of concerns. I know, just based on your clinical experience, what are some of the things that you're seeing, especially in this rising generation?
Yeah, Dr. Jeff, right now, I think probably the two things I'm seeing in the rising generation, which, you know, in college age and later high school and young adulthood aged young people, that's just naturally a really challenging developmental season. Mm-hmm. So just people are developing their sense of self, trying to discern their calling, navigating often really complex social infrastructures. And so there's just a lot to manage and not a lot of time having learned how to manage any of that stuff. So that's just a challenging season of life. I think the mood disorders, depression and anxiety are two really, really prevalent things that we're seeing in mental health as providers just all across the United States. So I think now maybe more than ever, young people are coming to mental health professionals and saying, Dr. T, I just have lost interest in almost everything. I can't bring myself to get out of bed. I don't want to eat, or I find myself overeating. I'm sleeping too much. I'm not sleeping enough. And to a provider, a mental health provider, that looks like depression or people feeling, young people feeling overwhelming anxiety, lots of uncertainty, lots of hesitancy, a restlessness without a clear sense of where to apply that restless energy. And that can get overwhelming to the point of panic attacks and just almost being immobilized by feelings of crippling anxiety. So off the cuff, for me, the literature bears this out, those are really the two most prominent things we're seeing in young adults today.
I know a lot of times when you see something trending, you see rises in anxiety and depression. It can mean that there's an actual rise, but it can also mean that your tools for analyzing are more sensitive, and so you're picking up more data than you otherwise would have picked up. But given all of that, what trends are you seeing?
Yeah, what else is interesting is the self-diagnostic capabilities of that same population. Mm-hmm. So it's not uncommon for a client who is a young adult to walk into my office with a really clearly articulated self-diagnosis.
Wow.
And what can be challenging about that is, and there's a psychological phenomenon called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. It's also called frequency illusion. And so when I become convicted about something, My brain is designed by God in a way to make the world in which I live as understandable and survivable as possible. So I tend to pick those things up more frequently than other things in my context. This often happens. I'll chase a rabbit trail. Maybe I shouldn't, but I'm going to. If you buy a new white Ford truck, let's say, and you drive off the lot, all of a sudden, everywhere you look, what do you notice?
The white Ford trucks.
White Ford trucks.
Yeah.
It's not that they're actually appearing at a greater frequency in your life. It's that your brain has just so familiarized itself with that type of truck, it picks out those trucks at a higher frequency to make your world more understandable, thus more survivable. And so when young people self-diagnose, they begin to see what they have diagnosed themselves with at a greater frequency, not necessarily because that's actually true, but because their brain is trying to make sense out of their world, make their world understandable and more survivable. And a young person's brain, very neuroplastic, very malleable, changeable. And so those types of convictions can lead to pretty pronounced changes in thinking and changes in core belief infrastructure that mean when a young person walks in and thinks they may have some really profound malady, they're really convicted about it, and that may not be the essence of what they're struggling with at all. So it presents a really challenging situation for young people to be in. There's such a voluminous access to information and not a lot of feedback on whether or not the information being absorbed is reliable or valid or even potentially useful.
Yes.
So we see young people take these really, really pronounced pathways in their thinking and their behavior and in their self-perception, their perception of the world and God, that because they're so desperate to make sense out of their world, they become very convicted about, and those very convictions may be the thing that is holding them back from the health that they seek.
Okay, that gets right to the heart of the issue. And you and I have talked a lot about, well, we've talked on this show quite a bit about transgenderism.
Right.
And you see the self-diagnosis. In fact, it's often said that you're the only one who can diagnose what you are. There's 68 different gender identities, and you go through the list and pick the one that you feel is right for you. So it's actually encouraged. But it leads to this sense of helplessness, which I am concerned by. I'm very concerned when students come to Summit Ministries, if we pick up signs of, anxiety or depression or suicidal ideation, and we're very good at coming around young people who have those things going on. But I'm also concerned that so many have diagnosed themselves with things that they think are unsolvable, that they no longer believe that they can actually change for the better.
You're right. You're right. Yeah, and I think, I'll just speak to the transgender issue just very briefly as far as that's concerned. And I'll circle back to a comment that I made earlier. Human beings are designed such that they require a clear sense of identity for survival. Who I am, what my place in the world is, what purpose God has designed me for, and how I can go about executing that purpose in a God-designed, God-ordained way. That's, in a sense, the essence of life. And so if I'm struggling with anxiousness or feelings of depression that are related to just a developmental stage or trouble navigating my social infrastructure, and I hop on the World Wide Web and I get caught up in this sort of self-diagnosis cycle that leads me down a path that ends up influencing my sense of self in a way that's not valid, accurate, healthy, or honest, and I get convicted about that to the point that I assimilate that identity, that identity assimilation in and of itself becomes kind of the core issue, so to speak. Wow. That's exactly right.
So learning the psychological language and using that to reinforce your understanding of your identity can actually make you more stuck.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've talked about this a lot, and I have so appreciated your heart and Summit's heart on this. As mental health professionals, we don't want to blame people for seeking relief from the pain they're experiencing. Unfortunately, our culture offers means of relieving pain that end up leading young people down pathways that amplify pain by many orders of magnitude and incarcerate them in a set of beliefs that make their pain really, really difficult to heal. And really, Jeff, that's the plight that more and more young people today find themselves unexpectedly and unintentionally right in the middle of.
There's so much to unpack from what you just said. There a couple of things come to my mind. One is just a media interview I had some time ago when it was announced by the federal government that anxiety questions would be added to the screening that general practitioners would do in every healthcare visit.
Sure.
And on the one hand, it's good that we're sensitive to the fact that people experience anxiety. On the other hand, and I tried to point this out in the interview, it did not go very well, that people who have access to wealth, middle class, upper class people, well, they can find good therapy.
Sure.
And they can pay for that. But what about a poor person? Well, they're just going to be given pills. They're going to be given anxiety pills. So who's behind saying that we need to do the screening about anxiety? And you might actually find who's selling anxiety pills.
Absolutely.
And then you can see who's really behind it. Now, I'm not dismissing the significance of medication as part of an overall solution. But I guess my real concern is just when people feel like they can't change. A good therapy involves work. You have to want to change at some level, right? I mean, you've got to want to set good boundaries and develop healthy habits, and then have accountability for developing those.
Yeah, absolutely. What's tough about the medication intervention for mental health is that often the symptoms a client presents with, like depression symptoms or anxiety symptoms, are the surface level expression of a deeper underlying issue. And so back to individuals who are impoverished that don't have access to quality mental health counseling, that are given a medication to treat this symptom, that just perpetuates the same cycle if the issue really is an underlying cause that manifests itself in the symptom that the medication is designed to treat. If we stop treatment there, then we never finish the healing process that clients have sought us out for initially.
Okay. So properly used medication should buy us time
and assist in the process
of working with those underlying issues. But very often it's seen as a means to an end. You have this problem, we can give you this pill, you're cured, have a good life.
Unfortunately, that's often the way mental health is treated, and in underserved populations, that seems to be especially true. I think that's why discussions like this and people being made aware of the reality of the significance of underlying issues and that people are desperately seeking relief from the pain of those underlying issues. It takes a lot for a young person or any person for that matter to darken the threshold of a psychiatrist's doorway or a psychologist's doorway or any mental health professional's doorway. And if we're stopping at the level of symptom and we don't get to the underlying core belief issues that manifest those symptoms, we're not helping people experience the healing that they're seeking us out for. What's challenging about that is that it drives people back to the same pain-relieving mechanisms that often are the reason they're seeking a counselor out in the first place, like misinformation on the World Wide Web that influences my sense of identity in ways that make me feel like something other than myself. And that's very unsettling, even for the most mature adult.
Yeah.
And so when that young person walks in and tells a mental health professional, I don't feel like myself, and I think that is anxiousness, and I don't dig into an underlying identity issue with them, a core sense of their self, that they are loved, that their life has purpose, that life has meaning and they matter, I just miss what might otherwise be an unbelievable opportunity for transformation. And I think Summit understands that very, very well.
Yeah. Well, our interests, obviously, at Summit Ministries are to prepare this generation to embrace God's truth and to champion a biblical worldview.
Absolutely.
We don't want them to just survive in this world. We want them to be those who, in turn, can bring blessing.
That's right.
To others. But in the process of that, I'm curious. I'm curious about parents and kids having these kinds of conversations before a child would be taken to a therapist. Hopefully there would be some sort of a conversation about what's really going on. But a lot of kids don't want to talk about it with parents, really. Is there a way to sort of break through that?
Yeah. Where I encourage parents to start is at the level of pursuit of heart. Heart pursuit of their kiddos, probably the best way to gain the influence needed to have discussions along these lines. And so I think lots of parents often see the symptoms that emerge as a result of underlying issues, feel uncertain, and that uncertainty influences hesitancy. What's the specific turn of phrase or topic of discussion or domain of experience we need to address? And my encouragement to parents as a first step, double down on some of the things your son or daughter are interested in, pursue their heart at a deep level, and through some shared common experience, parents gain moments where they can have influence. And then, and I sometimes say this to parents also, your kids have probably heard 4 or 5 times the things that you're embarrassed to talk about with them. And so my hope is in saying something like that, it emboldens parents. I think parents, out of respect for their children's maturity level and development, might hesitate. I think our culture is so saturated with just information that's often toxic. Kids are exposed to that much earlier than parents anticipate and much more frequently. And so pursuit of heart as a first step, and then an unapologetic and sort of very direct, gentle breach of topic that's rooted in truth and clarifies identity. And I'd love to share more about any of that, but that feels like a good overview of what the right approach should be.
Okay. Let's say it's difficult to jumpstart it somehow with a parent and a child. Some conversations, you'll see it. You'll see a cry for help of some kind. You'll hear them say something like, "I just don't see why I should go on."
Right.
Some, a level of expressed frustration that's far in excess of what the situation actually calls for. Anger, maybe you might see that. But how's a parent going to start addressing that? What do they actually say?
Yeah, I want to reinforce the power of human connection. So in mental health research today, we know more about the nuclear power of human connectedness, and I'm not understating that, and I could demonstrate that in the lit, than we've ever known before. For example, if you experience a pain about the same magnitude as a bee sting, and a loved one is holding your hand and speaking endearingly to you, the pain-sensing regions of your brain function qualitatively differently in the presence of a loving, trusted other.
Wow.
Then your brain experiences pain in isolation. And so, without question, the first things to say are behavioral, and they're all said through the pursuit of the heart of a person that you love. And our culture is pursuing kids at the heart level. They're showing up, they're providing support, they're reinforcing ideology, and it's constantly available. Chat rooms and social media and everything you can imagine. And so parents are in a sense kind of pushing against that. And so definitely it feels important to just reinforce it is much better well done on the front end than well said. Any thought about that before I move on?
No, I know that. No.
Okay.
I love that direction. Yes. So you're being there, the connection, even saying, listen, I don't really know how to be here for you, but I want you to know I'm not going away.
For sure.
I'm here.
For sure.
And it may take time. I want you to know we're going to walk alongside each other.
Our culture is not rejecting kids who are seeking out support. It doesn't matter what the need for support is. Culture is showing up no matter what. And so I definitely think that that's important. And not every situation is going to call to mind the right thing to say. But if we can lean in and reinforce, I'm not going to reject you based on what you're struggling with. I'm not going to abandon you. I may not have an easy answer, but I'm going to be with you in this, and I'm committed to supporting you through it. That reinforcement of connectedness, also just to verbally reassure young people about, really, really, really important. As a rule, I'm encouraging parents next to try to get some information regarding what's going on. In other words, when you see an incongruent response, the reaction doesn't match the context, that's a really great window parents can use to discern maybe there's something underlying this moment that we need to discuss. Just an attitude of curiosity and trying to ask questions in ways that influence a little bit of dialogue. The more a parent knows about what's going on, I think the better a parent can help. I think there's a behavioral component to this whole dynamic. Sometimes parents are going to have to step in and protect kids from toxic influences.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the rate of increase of toxic influences on young people in today's culture is astronomically high. And so parents providing some insulation and an infrastructure of support to protect kids also feels like a really critical thing to be aware of. I think if kids were being honest, what they would really point to as the primary underlying things they're struggling with: feeling excluded, a deep desire to belong, feeling valued, that at the level of my core identity, I am worthwhile. And I think each of those things influences the third thing that young people are looking for: feeling connected. And so wherever parents kind of go with those discussions, those are the three domains that, in my experience today, especially post-COVID, Dr. Jeff, everybody's isolated, life's uncertain. Those are the areas that young people are struggling with the most.
Yeah. Well, Dr. T, I wanted to ask you a question about something that I've talked with other people about, but I'm curious what you think about this. A lot of people will realize at some point we need somebody to help us, because we're going to need therapy.
Right.
And in some circles, it's good. Everybody has a therapist.
Right,
It's sort of like everybody's got their guru sort of thing. But in other ways, if we are calling for outside help, it says something bad about us that we can't fix this ourselves. When would you know that it's important to bring somebody into the conversation, specifically a therapist, to help?
Yeah, I think that normally in life, and I don't like that word, but it is useful for the sake of our discussion, there is an ebb and flow of mood and satisfaction and feeling of connection. As a general recommendation, when a person experiences a dip in mood, that their sort of traditional or typical rhythms of life don't help them think their way through or work their way through, it's really important to consider someone who's got a little bit of expertise in helping others as an option in those moments.
Okay. Well, we know that there are some therapy methods that actually make things worse rather than better. And when you studied for your doctorate in counseling psychology, you probably had an entire class on the litany of all of the techniques that people have tried that made things worse rather than better. So I just sort of make the assumption that now today, if you look on the internet who are therapists in my area, there are people probably practicing things that would be harmful, not helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how do you make a wise decision about that?
Yeah, so without question, the first criteria I'm looking for is a Christian therapist who is rooted in biblical truth.
Okay.
So to me, that's an irrefutable, non-negotiable. I think what's important, and when I say that, sometimes I get people who push back and they'll say, well, Trent, I've been really hurt by, the church, or my son or daughter had a really terrible experience in youth ministry. They would never walk in a church, or if they knew the counselor was a Christian counselor or a Christian mental health professional, professional. They'd never, set foot in that person's office. And I think that mental health professionals who are doing quality mental health counseling are often not book, chapter, and versing people day one, minute one. But without being anchored in truth, there really is no way to plot a path towards healing. And biblical truth is the only absolute truth in life this side of heaven. And so that, to me, is the first and most critical criteria. And I can talk more about that. I think the second thing that I'm interested in, and there are a lot of different credentialing sort of agencies or credentialing bodies in mental health. And there are great providers in most of those. There are providers who are not great in most of those. What feels really important to me is that the provider's not just treating a symptom, but is looking to an underlying issue that influences the symptom to manifest. Sometimes clients' symptoms are so severe, overwhelming anxiety, for example, that I need to address the symptom immediately to help provide the relief required for the person to sustain their treatment process long enough to heal the underlying issues. Yeah. So it's not that we don't want to address symptoms, and in some cases we need to do that immediately. And I don't want clinicians to stop there with their clients. I want to dig into the underlying root causes, so to speak, to really promote deep healing, especially in young people. What's really tragic is a young person has a lifetime on which they can build healthy rhythms and core beliefs and spiritual disciplines. If we can heal them when they walk into a clinician's office the first time, we've got 40 to 80 years potentially of life that they can live in a healthy way. So those really feel like important moments to get down to the root causes of issues and to promote healing. Those would be the two things I think I would say off the cuff.
Okay, that's really wise. Is there, well, let me tell you a quick story and see. I'm curious how you respond to it. With one of my kids, we were having a really tough
don't
time.
trick me here, Dr.
This is no trick. We had a really tough time communicating, and I thought, I need somebody who's a neutral third party to help us break through.
Yep.
And we went to, it did not turn out at all the way I expected. It was positive.
Okay.
But it did not turn out the way I expected. In fact, one of the things that came up was my child being asked by the therapist, what would you like to do with your dad? And the answer was, I'd like to just do normal stuff. Like, I just want to go to a movie with my dad.
Right.
Or, it was that kind of thing. And I realized, I'm pretty intense. And if I'm always drilling down on my son, well, we're going to have a really intense conversation about this or that. What he really wanted was just that, that time. And so I think it was an interesting thing.
That sounds great.
I don't know how we would have arrived at that if there hadn't been somebody sitting there talking to us who was, in a way, a disinterested observer, but also someone sensitive to the dynamics.
Absolutely. Yeah, I could talk a long time about this. As a rule, relationships exist in really predictable patterns of interaction. And so often in those patterns of interaction, relationships endure seasons that influence what we could call gridlock for the sake of our discussion today.
Yeah.
And when a relationship gets gridlocked, like you and one of your kiddos kind of just felt gridlocked, what got us into gridlock was the fact that I think the way I think about this problem, and they think the way they think about the problem, and neither of us can think anything other than the way we think.
Yeah.
That's the huge benefit of having an outside person, of involving an outside person. You bring another infrastructure of thought and experience and truth into a dynamic like that helps a relationship find its way out of gridlock. What's interesting about what you're saying is, and I think sometimes this makes the wonderful clients that I've been able to serve over the years frustrated, is I don't necessarily have the most profound things to say all the time, sometimes the most profound things to say are the simplest, just most basic. You guys should just go to a movie, right? And I wish it was more complicated than that sometimes. But that's a really wonderful example. And I also think, too, it ties back to what I see very often with kids just being desperate to know that I belong, that I'm worthwhile, that I'm well connected. And well-intentioned parents are going the second mile trying to provide that the best way they can with the way that they think. And it's not that parent's fault. And if it just lands wrong on the kid, which is not necessarily the kid's fault either, it can lead to gridlock that involving an outside party would really help release. Yeah. That's a great example.
You know, in some of the different things that I've done in business or in ministry, we focused a lot on coaching skills. And there are levels of professionalism in coaching as well. Just because somebody says they're an executive coach doesn't really mean they're going to help you. But one of the interesting things is in coaching is as you're reflecting what somebody says, you're sort of holding up a mirror so they can see themselves say it. And it is fascinating how many times the breakthrough is, I knew all along what to do. I just needed to hear myself say it and hear you say it back to me.
That's right. You're exactly right. The other thing that you kind of triggered in me, just to speak to parents, sometimes I'll teach parents the difference in being a coach versus a referee. And I often think when we're addressing issues of mental health, it's easy for parents to assume the role of a referee and want to get out the rule book and like, this is the path and here are the boundaries and these are the guidelines and this is the way. And that's all really important. You couldn't play a game of football without that infrastructure of rules. And players aren't running through brick walls for referees. Right. It's the connection they have with the coach that influences their best performance. And so when you said coach, I'm like, that's an important parenting idea.
Really important. Yeah. Great analogy.
Sure.
Yeah. One thing, and again, I know the audience is very broad for this show. Grandparents, parents, people who aren't married.
Sure.
People who are believers, people who are not believers. So you've got this really interesting mix. But I feel like I'm speaking from a parent's heart today and wanting to speak to a parent's heart. Peer influences. So I face in our summer program and in my own family experiences where the peer influence is negative and this child is spiraling. Other situations in which the peer influence is positive and girds them up to be stronger in the face of challenges without trying to establish play dates and things like that. How does a parent encourage positive peer interaction?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. I'm going to say two things on that. I think the first is the way I interact with my kids, and this is just a general principle, is the way I program them to feel most normal in terms of their interaction patterns with their friends.
Okay, unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So if my parenting approach is very one-sided, I don't listen well, and I'm opinionated, which all of that is very valuable in certain contexts. Whether or not that's valuable in the parenting approach with this certain child, not really relevant to this discussion. What is that I influence them to have a response to that becomes generalized. And so if my approach, let's say I exhibit those features of my demeanor really consistently, induces lots of pushback, then my child is likely going to experience that same pushback anytime that an individual interacts with them in ways like that. If I'm very easygoing, approachable, I listen well, I'm open-hearted and have the ability to experience, and this is how I would define empathy, a little bit of movement of heart at their distress. I influence them to tend towards those same types of relationships. And so that feels like a really critical just first piece. The second piece is if parents can kind of get out ahead, and you're saying, we might not be able to organize play dates. That's true. And where your life rhythms exist, your children's life rhythms will exist. Some clinicians say what you do in moderation, your children will do in excess. And so if your regular sort of rhythms of life involve church and connection with neighbors and community with extended family, if those things are available to you, kids will tend kind of towards that.
Okay.
And so those tendencies are also really, really important to just be aware of in how we're influencing our kiddos. What you watch, your kids are going to tend to be interested in. What you listen to, your kids are going to exhibit those same tendencies. And creating space to familiarize them with why you're interested in what you're interested in, and helping them understand why what's important to you is important to you, helps them construct their sort of worldview, sense of self, life rhythm, infrastructure in important ways. I'd say in general, that's where I'd want to start.
Yeah. Well, I take that to heart, and I'm recalling the first time you were on this podcast, and you shared your personal story.
Yeah.
I hope anybody who's watching or listening who's interested, it is profound. What you went through as a young person, the mental health issues, addiction, all of those kinds of things that you went through as a young person. So your experience that you're sharing now, I know, comes out of that heart where you've found healing through Jesus.
Absolutely.
And now it can be the wounded healer is a term that I've
Henry
heard.
Nouwen. Yeah, that's exactly right. So that's definitely true. The 10,000-foot view, experienced lots of pain in childhood, sought relief from that pain, unfortunately, through substances. And for about 12 years, had as hardcore of a substance abuse problem as a person could have and survive. And how does a person like that survive? Outside of a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, Dr. Jeff, I don't know that I would have survived. And so I surrendered my life to Christ in December of 2004, and by the grace of God have been transformed ever since. So you can get sober and break free from the depths of addiction and stay that way. And I'll tie that back to a relationship too. My relationship with Jesus Christ is the one I can always depend on, that will never fail, that won't abandon me or leave or forsake me. It's not that I feel great all the time. I've dealt with burnout and major challenges in adulthood, but that's a relationship I've always been able to come back to. And so just to encourage our listeners, if anybody who hears this podcast is really desperately struggling with a mental health issue, my encouragement, there's just not a lot I personally have not struggled with. My encouragement is to really consider the Lord Jesus Christ as the source of healing needed for long-term transformation in life. Almost 18 years later, happily married, doing mental health on a podcast with Dr. Jeff. It's a really cool story, and I'm a very blessed man. I've been highly favored.
Well, I've loved this conversation. There was one thing that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to just trace down real quick. And that was, you mentioned something about church hurt. Somebody might not want to go to a Christian counselor because, they're Christians, I know those people, they hurt me. We, in fact, earlier today had a workshop for our whole staff on one of the reasons kids walk away from their faith. They're disenchanted because of their experience with church. Just speak to that for a moment. Let's say that's something that's happening in a family. Really, really. The tough thing about church is it's filled with imperfect people. And I think this is true of mental health professionals and lay professionals, and certainly people who are in churches. Often, Jeff, I think people mean well, but their best intentions can unfortunately cause pain. Yeah. And so, again, maybe the referee coach metaphor here feels appropriate. As Christians, we know truth, and we know the pathway of freedom in life. And I think it's easy to operate off the presupposition that if I could just get them to know it, then that's transformational. Yeah. And I think people know it's sometimes just really hard to apply it. Right. And so that's where a relational component, at least for a mental health professional, feels really, really critical. If I don't have truth, I don't have a path that I can direct a person down towards healing.
And maybe the missing piece for some people is a relationship. So I say that to say, if you've been hurt by the church, and I'm not sure which camera.
Yeah.
Right I just would like to offer an apology. I'm sorry if you've sought help and you've been helped in ways that have just reinforced pain, or that haven't led to the kind of pain relief or outcomes that you've sought after. I want to encourage you to reconsider and to seek support from a biblical counselor or a Christian counselor who's a mental health professional, or a local church, and persist until you find somebody that can love you well and guide you in truth. I spend lots of time with people who have just been hurt by the church.
Yeah.
And we need to make amends for that as a family of God, and also encourage people not to give up on God's kingdom, because that's where we find the support and healing that we really need.
Wow. Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap up the show than that. I really appreciate that. So Dr. Trent Langhofer, thanks for coming to be a part of the show once again.
My pleasure, Dr. Jeff. So great to see you, my friend.
Thank you to my guest today, Trent Langhofer, for coming on the show. The Apostle Paul calls us to not be conformed to the patterns of the secular world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds in the power of the Spirit. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it, and leave a review if you would on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.